So in this session, we're going to cover some of the REST interoperability features that were introduced in some of the releases of PowerBuilder 2017. First, we're going to do a legal disclaimer, and then we're going to get right into the agenda. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit, just so that if you are not familiar with who I am, you might have some idea of why you'd be interested in anything I have to say. Then we'll go into a little bit of an introduction, how I set up some of the samples. Then we're going to talk about the REST client object that was added. Then we're going to talk about the HTTP client and the JSON generator and JSON parser that have been added. Then we'll talk about the OAuth client. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some JSON formats that are going to become important, particularly with PowerBuilder 2018, when we're going to be able to do some operations that are essentially the same thing as get full state, set full state that you used to do under distributed PowerBuilder, but we're going to do it with JSON instead. And essentially the ability to send not only data, but metadata, including state information between the client and server. So first, a little bit about me. I've been using PowerBuilder a long time. I got started back with version 10B when I was working for a county agency up in Santa Barbara, California. I quickly decided after I got familiar with PowerBuilder that I wanted to be a PowerBuilder contractor, independent. And so I started doing that in 1993, and I did that until 2004. So basically 11 years I was doing independent contracting, doing PowerBuilder development. At that point, I joined a company called Integrated Data Services, and at the time, their bread and butter application was a PowerBuilder client-server application. We've since actually have migrated that to HTML5 JavaScript, but we do have a couple clients who still prefer to use the client-server version, and so we are still actively doing development on that and actively still using PowerBuilder. So the way a lot of people know me, however, is because there used to be a magazine that was dedicated to PowerBuilder called the PowerBuilder Developers Journal, and I wrote a number of articles for that. I was the senior editor for about the last 10 years it was around. The other reason a lot of people know me is because since the PowerSoft days, there have been community forums out there where people could go and ask questions, and other PowerBuilder developers would answer them, and that dated back to CompuServe forums. Then later with the internet, with NNTP forums, and then after that, online communities such as ones run by Sybase and SAP, and currently the ones run by Appeon. So I've been involved in all of those to the degree that in the PowerSoft days, they made me part of what was called Team PowerSoft, which was recognizing our community, our contribution to the community. There was a Team Sybase, there was Appeon MPVs, there was a SAP Mentor, and then of course the most recent is the Appeon MPV. So I'm an Appeon MPV, as are a number of other people, recognizing the contribution that we make to the PowerBuilder community. So suffice it to say, I've been using PowerBuilder a really long time, and I'm really good at using it. So enough about me. A little mention of the company I work for, and we'll get right into the introduction. So I've got some sample code that's going to be available from the conference website that you can look at. We're going to actually look at the code here online, but in this session, but you'll be able to grab that at your leisure later and play with it. Because I wanted to allow you to be able to use the methods without having to create an account someplace, what I did for a lot of the samples is I used a site called JSON Placeholder, and it doesn't require authentication or a user account, so that the samples will just work right out of the box. But in order to do that, their get method works. It goes and grabs data, brings it back. Their put patch, and delete methods, the update methods, indicate that they succeeded. In fact, the post method will actually send you back an ID value of the row you supposedly added, but they don't actually do anything to the data, because they want to preserve the data, because they've got users from all over the place hitting this, and so that you never actually update data. It's basically a mock method, so that you can see what the method would look like and how it would send data and how it would get a response back, but it doesn't actually change anything. So, a little caveat I would note here is that according to the REST protocol, you can return anything from a REST web service that has a MIME encodable format. So you could return XML, you could return PDF, you could return a zip file. All those are valid payloads from a REST web service. However, the only thing PowerBuilder supports is the format that actually the vast majority of REST web services do use, which is JSON. It's a JavaScript object notation is what the acronym stands for. But that is really somewhat the de facto standard for what REST web services return, and it's all that PowerBuilder supports. Okay, so what we're going to do for this sample is we're going to pull a list of posts from the JSON placeholder site. For the REST client, that's all I'm going to do is pull data. When we get into the HTTP client and some of the other objects, we're going to simulate inserts, updates, and deletes as well. Now, in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data window, an external source data window. And that is going to have columns whose names match the names of the data elements that are coming from the web service. And that just makes the mapping of the data very convenient. So if you do a call to a JSON placeholder, this is an example of the kind of data it sends back. So it sends back a user ID, which is supposed to indicate the user who's making a particular post. There's an ID value, which is the number of the actual post, and then the title and the body, and you can see it's just randomly generated words. Not even words, it's just random characters, just to simulate data. So the data actually doesn't mean anything. It's just for demonstrating how REST web services work. So what I need is in my external source data window, I need 4 columns: a user ID and ID that are numbers, and a title and body that are strings. So that's what I created. Here's my external source data window. I've got a user ID and ID that are number, and a title and body that are string. Now the reason I said 4,000 characters is just because I am primarily do work with Oracle, and up until version 12c came out, the largest value that you could put in an Oracle varchar2 column was 4,000 characters, and so anytime I'm creating a data window and I want to indicate a really big string column, I put 4,000. That's just a force of habit there. So there's the definition of my data window. Okay, so there are some methods that we're going to be using on the REST. Well, we're not actually going to use them on the REST client. I'm just going to show what they are. They're not used in this particular sample, but we have the ability to get, set, and clear request headers. So if you're doing, if you decided you need to do basic authentication, you could do a set request header, which would contain the basic authentication keys, or whatever you need to provide or read back from the request. There's response status code. So you check that to indicate whether or not the call worked. And there are some standard codes that are returned. Anything in the 200 series usually indicates that the service worked, and there's some so 200 usually means okay, and then some other values, 201, 202, have specific meanings other than just okay, and we'll cover those in a second. Anything in the 300 series means that the call you made got redirected to another URL. Anything in the 400 series indicates that there was a client error, and anything in the 500 series indicates that there was a server error. So the main thing we're interested in is, did we get an answer in the 200 series, or did we get something else? For the success codes, this is what I was mentioning before. So 200 usually means okay. 201 means usually means that you did an insert of a row, and so 201 means what you sent was created rather than just OK. And 202 usually means accepted. So those are the main response codes we're looking for. There's also get response status text. So if the REST web service indicates some sort of error message, let's say in the 500 series, or actually any of these codes, but it'd be primarily in the 500 series you'd be worried about, you might get some extra information there in that about what went wrong with the response. Okay. So, yeah, for the REST client, the REST client is made to work with a data window. That's what it brings data down into. So when you do a retrieve, you're doing a retrieve into a data window. And so in order for that to work, the method you need to be calling needs to return a simple array. Now, a lot of web services don't do that. They actually return more complicated nested data structures. So if the web service you're calling doesn't return a simple array, then you're going to have to look at some of the other options like the HTTP client that we'll be covering in a few minutes. But if it is a simple array like this JSON placeholder is, then you can use the REST client. And of course, if you're creating the web service yourself, you can make sure that you create it in such a way that it returns simple data. Right now, it only supports retrieve. You can't do updates using the REST client. That is being looked at as a possible feature for PowerBuilder 2018. So here's an example of using the REST client. So you just create an instance, declare an instance of the REST client, create it, and then you call the retrieve method. You pass in the data window that you want the data put into, and you indicate the URL that you're going to be calling. So in this case, I'm just asking for all of the posts that are in this JSON placeholder site. There is a third argument you can pass, which would be arguments that you would want to provide with the URL. In this case, I'm not providing arguments, so I'm not providing that additional argument there. And this is what it ends up looking like when I do the request using the REST client. The REST client also has some properties. One of them is secure protocol. So if you know there's a particular secure protocol that you're going to be wanting to use, you could set it for one of those protocols. However, if you leave it at the default, which is 0, what it will do is it will start over here with TLS 1.2 and attempt to use that. And if the service won't accept the TLS 1.2, it will step down to 1.1. And it'll keep stepping down until it finds one, the most secure one that it can send that the server will actually accept. And there's also timeout. So this is how long the client is going to wait for a response from the web service before it decides to give up. Defaults to 60 seconds. If you set to 0, it means that you'll wait indefinitely for the service to respond. So that's the REST client. Like I said, just for returning data, it doesn't do updates, and it has to be a flat data set. For anything more complicated, or if you want to do updates, currently what you would do is use the HTTP client and the JSON generator and JSON parser. The parser to parse out the JSON you got back, and then the generator to put together the JSON you want to send for the update. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to use that same REST web service, but we're going to use the HTTP client to do it, to do the retrieve, and then we're going to look at actually doing updates using the HTTP client as well. So this is an example of sending a request for data to the REST web service. Now, anytime you're using a REST web service, what you're going to have to do is get a hold of some documentation, because there's nothing like with the old SOAP web services. There was something called WSDL files, and WSDL files would define the service and what arguments it would take, and what the URLs were and everything. And you could use a tool on that would generate a client for you. REST web services aren't really documented like that. Usually what you get is human readable documentation, and then you have to put the code, the calls together yourself based on that documentation. So by convention, usually if you're doing a retrieve, use the get method. Delete is obviously used for delete. Post is usually used for, it could be used for updates. It could also be used for inserts. It basically, post is used for sending data. Get can't send data. That's why you don't use it for, you use it mainly for retrieves, because it doesn't have a data payload. But there's no standard in REST for what the other verbs do. It's mainly by convention. So like I said, you have to get the documentation for the site you're using and determine if you're going to be doing an insert or an update, whether it's a post or a put, or what particular method you're going to use to do that. So in this sample, now I've got a whole bunch of local variables declared here. You're seeing just the very beginning of the code. These local variables will get used later. But I'm going to declare an instance of the HTTP client and create the instance. I'm going to send the request, and for this particular service, for a retrieve, I'm going to issue the get, and then once again, we've got the URL we're going to call, which is in this case just retrieves all the posts. And here's where I'm checking. I check two things. I check the response from the send request call, so I make sure that it's one. And I'm also checking that get response status code. So I mentioned that with the REST client, that it's got this get response status code. The HTTP client has it as well. I'm checking to see if it's equal to 200. And if both of those are true, that means I actually got data back. And so then there's a second method we call an HTTP client called get response body, which then accepts the JSON into a string. And then we're going to parse that JSON out. So that's what's going on here. So now I get my JSON parser object, declare that, create an instance, and then I load the string into the JSON parser object. So it's kind of like the PBDOM stuff, where we were loading XML into this object and then using methods of the object to parse out the various XML attributes. We're doing the same thing here, but we're doing it with JSON. So in this case, I happen to know I'm getting a rather simple data set back. So I get the root item, so that gets set to root, and then I'm going to do the child count, which is basically how many rows did I get back. I'm going to use that same data window, so I'm issuing a reset on the data window just to clear it out, and then I'm looping through all the columns. All the rows in the JSON I got back. So I do an insert row on the data window. I do a get child item that gets the first row, and then I do a get item number or get item string to get the individual data elements out of the JSON, and then do the set items to set the values into the individual columns in my data window. And once again, I'm doing this. I mean, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense for this particular sample, but if this is a more complex structure, that's why I would be doing it, because I'm going to be translating this more complex structure into the rather flat data window that I have to be putting this data window, this data into. Because I'm going to be doing updates, I want to do a reset update so that the data window status flags are all now set back to not modified. Because as I was doing these inserts and updates, a bunch of these got set to new modified. As far as the data window was concerned at that point, this was new data, and it's not really new data. It's just my retrieve. It's essentially my retrieve. So I do the reset update that gets the row status flags back to not modified, and then when the user makes changes, then the flags will be set appropriately. So here I'm just indicating what I was doing there. Using the get response body to get the JSON, and then using the JSON parser to parse it out into rows and columns. So that's how I do the retrieve, and the results look just like what we did with REST client. It looks exactly the same and actually performs almost exactly the same as well in this particular case. So now I want to do an update. So here's my code for this. Once again, there's a bunch of local variables I've created. I've got these constants here. Remember the response codes we're looking for, 200 being okay, 201 being created for when I do an insert. Now I've got my HTTP client again. I've got the generator and the parser. The generator is largely what I'm going to be using to put together the JSON payload that I'm going to be sending to the update methods. And the parsers, I believe, we'll get into it in a minute, but I think I only use that when I do an insert to pull out the value that got inserted for the value that was returned to indicate what the new row ID is for the inserted row. So I created here instances of all the different objects I'm going to be using. I'm doing an accept text, so all the changes that the user has made actually get through the edit controls and are validated and in the DataWindow columns. I'm going to loop through, in this case, all of the rows and check to see what their item status is at. So I'm passing 0 for the get item status to get the row status. So I'm basically looking to see, is this an inserted row? Is it a modified row? It's not. It wouldn't be a deleted row because a deleted row is in the deleted buffer, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I'm mainly looking for new rows and modified rows. So in either case, I'm going to create a JSON object, a blank JSON object. I'm going to get the values from the data window for the user ID, the title, and the body of what was either inserted or updated for this particular row. Because you remember there were 4 columns: the user ID, title, and body. We're going to need all the time the ID value, which represents the ID value of this row, won't be modified if this is an update, because that's the key for that row. If it's a new row, I'm not going to populate it because that's the value I'm going to be getting back from the service. The service is going to tell me what that value is. So I get those 3 values, and then I check to see whether it's a new modified or data modified to determine what am I going to do about that 4th value, which is the ID value. So if it's inserted, I'm going to I don't need to get any additional data. I'm just going to use the getJSON string method on the JSON generator to get my JSON that represents the 3 elements that I'm sending for this new row, and the null for the ID value. And now in this particular service, remember I mentioned earlier, you need to figure out what method you need to call. By method I mean whether it's a get, post, put, or delete, or option, or there's a few other verbs out there as well. It's usually get, post, and put or patch that are used for and delete that are used for REST calls. And so this will be a post, and this is the URL I'm calling, but now I'm passing in, now I have an argument, and the argument in this case is my row of new data that I'm sending as JSON. And what PowerBuilder is going to do under the covers there is create a post request and then send that as data on the post request. So I send that, I get the response status code back, and now I'm looking for something different. I'm not looking for the OK because this is an insert. I'm looking for created, the 201 code. So if I got a 201 back, it means it did create the row, or at least it says it created the row, and it sent me back an ID value in the JSON response. And so that's where I'm going to use the JSON parser here. So I'm going to get the response body, which contains the ID value that was assigned, do a load string on that to get it into the JSON parser, get the root item. I'm then going to look for that particular ID value, and I'm going to grab that ID value. I'm going to set it back into the data window so that if I do any further updates on this data window, I've got the correct key for that row. If I didn't get a 201 back, I'm going to send an error message back to the user saying that the insert failed. So that's for an insert. Now for an update, I do need the ID value. Remember I got those other 3 columns before? Now I go ahead and get the 4th column. This is the key value that should not be changing. And I add that to my JSON generator. I get the JSON back out of the JSON generator, and I send it once again, just like you saw in that earlier request. It's a put request. So for updates for this particular service, inserts are done through post, updates are done through put, and so that's what I'm doing here. And like I said, that you have to check with the individual methods, see what you use. For the development we do, where we're doing, my company does for REST web services, we generally use post for actually for insert, update, and delete. We use get for retrieves and then put for everything else. What we use is the URL to indicate which particular action we're taking, whether it's an insert, update, or delete. In any event, so the URL we're going to call is the same URL you've seen before, where we have the posts, but now we're going to indicate there's a particular row we're updating, and that's part of the URL. Is the row that we're updating, and it's also included in the payload. So there's the URL with the ID value and the payload that's being sent as JSON string. I'm checking the response status code. If it says it's okay, I just say, if it's not okay, I just say update failed, otherwise it worked, and we move on. Because what we've done also is we've done the inserts and deletes. We haven't done the updates yet. I'm sorry, the deletes yet. We'll get to that in a minute. If the row is not new modified or data modified, then I don't need to process it. And that's what this last piece is for the rows that are not modified. I just skip them. So let's deal with deletes. Deletes are in the delete buffer. So I'm now going to loop through the rows that are in the delete buffer. And once again, I'm going to grab the ID value, and that's basically all I need to grab. I don't need the rest of the data that's in the row in order to do a delete. I just need the ID value. That's the key for the row. So I get that number, and I just create a URL. Now, once again, by convention, you need to read the documentation, figure out which method you need to use. For this particular service, it's the delete method is what we use to do a delete. The same URL as we saw before, and once again, like the update, the URL includes the ID value of the row we are updating. But in this case, we don't need to send a payload. The fact that we send a delete and the ID value as part of the URL is all this service needs to know in order to delete that row. So it deletes that row. I check the status code. If we don't get an OK, the delete failed, otherwise it worked. And then at the very end here, after I've done both my inserts, my updates, and my deletes, I do a reset update. I'm doing that manually because we're not using the update method of the data window. We're doing it all by hand here in the using the HTTP client. So that's I'm basically describing here what I just described as we were going through the code. Looking to the primary data window buffer for inserts and updates. Using the JSON generator to put together the JSON I need to do those. Using the send request method to send a post if it's a insert, and check for a 201, or using the put this is the insert still. So I use the post call, do the post call, check for the 201, and then parse the ID value back out. If I'm doing an update, the primary key is part of the data, and we use the put instead of the post. And the URL that we use includes the ID value. And we check for 200 rather than 201, because 201 means created, 200 just means the update worked. And if its update works fine, it depends on your service. Some of them don't return data back. Some of them actually will return the row back to you. You just got to read the documentation, see what's going on. For deletes, loop through the data window delete buffer, and all we need is the ID value, and we send the delete, and we look for the 200 code. So that's an example of using the HTTP client. Once again, when I get to the end of the routine, issue the reset update. Okay, so there's some properties on the HTTP client. A couple of these we already handled when we talked about the REST client, particularly secure protocol and timeout. There's a couple more options here, and what this is for is if you're doing a large data set, you can actually basically paginate through the data. If auto read data is set to true, that means, and which is the default, that means when you read a response from the web service, you read all of the data in at once. If it's set to false, you can actually read chunks of data, and so that's how you deal with a really large result set. And then these methods were discussed under REST client as well, at least the ones having to do with the request headers and the status code and the response status text. Those were all the same as the REST client. But there's some additional methods here, and these are the ones that are, oh, sorry, too far. These are the ones that are used when you're parsing through the data in chunks. So you would use the post data start, post data end to send large amounts of data, or read data in order to read data in smaller chunks. Okay, so that's the REST client, HTTP client, JSON parser, JSON generator. Next, we're going to cover OAuth. Now, OAuth is what OAuth is a method of authentication for using REST web services, and there are a number of options for doing it. OAuth is really the majority player out there, though. And so, in order to use OAuth, one of the things that's available to us is an OAuth client. There's a couple other changes as well that allows us to do OAuth. So OAuth has two methods. You request an access token, and to do that, there's a token request object and a token response object. Once you get the token back, you can then do, at least with the OAuth client, you can do request resource, where you call the particular method with your OAuth request, and you pass in the token request as one of the parameters or one of the properties of your OAuth request, and you get a response back from the resource. The thing to keep in mind here is that once you've got an access token, you don't have to keep calling it this over and over again. Generally, you call that once, and once you've got the token back, you can use the token over and over again to do multiple resource calls. Usually, the access token will have a timeout value, and until that timeout value passes, that token can be used for as many calls as you need to make without having to request another access token. Now, in order to demonstrate this, of course, we're doing authentication, so we're going to have to use a service that requires authentication. So I'm going to provide you with some sample code. Once again, it will be available from the conference website. But you're going to have to go in there and change some values, because you're going to have to set up your own keys. I'm going to be using Twitter for this particular example, and I'll show you how to do that as part of this demo. It'll show you how to create those keys that you would use, and then you could go ahead and use this sample code with your own Twitter account. So the first thing I did is I went to apps.twitter.com and I created an application for my account. There are two ways to set up authentication, OAuth authentication, in Twitter. You can do it as a person. In other words, when this application runs, it actually is basically impersonating you. It's actually working with your full permissions. In order to do that, though, when you first run it, you actually have to log into Twitter and grant it permission to do stuff on your behalf. And I really don't want to get into that for the purposes of this demo. What you can do is you can also just say this account I'm setting up is just an app. It's not impersonating a user. It's just an app that does stuff. In that case, it can only read the information off Twitter. It can't post anything. And that's what I'm doing for this particular example. Is I'm just going to have it search for tweets. It's not going to be doing any posting. So it's only going to do application only authentication, which means I don't have to do this separate login into Twitter. I can use the keys directly from the apps.twitter.com site that I'll be creating to interface with Twitter. So this is what I was just mentioning. You can create an application that can do things on behalf of users. And particular examples, I use Buffer and Flipboard are a couple third-party applications I use to interact with Twitter. Flipboard actually doesn't. It may do posting, but I don't use it for that. I just use it for reading Twitter. But Buffer does do posting for me. So Buffer's a utility I use to do posting on Twitter. And so it does this login and grant permissions to an app thing that's required in order to do posting. But I don't want to do that, so like I said, I'm just going to go in, and I called this particular application Elevate Demo for obvious reasons here. And you'll notice there is a tab here saying Keys and Access Token. So once you go ahead and create the application, you go to that tab, and then it shows you it's basically like a user ID and password. They call it the consumer ID and consumer secret, but they essentially work as a user ID and password for accessing Twitter as an application only. So here's what happens when you're doing OAuth. You take your consumer ID and consumer secret, and you do basic authentication with it. Now you're not going to have to worry about all this. I'm just explaining what PowerBuilder is doing under the covers for you. So what happens in basic authentication is you take your user ID and your password, you put a colon between them, put them together as a single string of text. You then base64 encode that, and you add it to a request header with the word basic in front of it. So the request header would say basic : space, and then it would have this base64 encoded string, which is your user ID and password. And then what the application you're talking to when you're doing the authentication sends back is your token. You then take that token, and every time you do a request, you put in a request header that says bearer and a space, and then this string that they sent you when you authenticated. And you just do that over and over again. So that's what happens under the curves. Like I said, you don't have to worry about that because PowerBuilder is going to do all that for you. Here's another example of how that works. You put your consumer key and secret together. You send it over through basic authentication. Twitter returns this token to you. So now you have a token. Now down here, this is the thing you call over and over again. Now notice this loop here. This part isn't called again unless the token expires. And Twitter actually doesn't expire tokens. Once you get a token from Twitter, you can use it forever. But in any event, you do a resource request, and you pass in that token that you were sent as one of the headers in your request. And then Twitter sends you back data, and then you just keep looping through here as often as you need to. So you need to check with the servers you're using to see how long the tokens are good for, because if they do have a whatever life they have, then you would have to repeat this part of the request after a certain amount of time. We don't have to do that with this particular example. You can send additional requests for tokens. If you do it too many times, though, Twitter thinks you're trying to spam it, and we'll start denying them. So you need to be careful with that. So here's an example of what I'm going to eventually get here. So I put in some search term I'm going to search for. In this case, I put in #PowerBuilder. I request an access token. I get the token. I hit search. I get this value back, and then at that point, I can change search terms, hit search again, and keep doing that over and over again. I don't have to do that request access token again once I've got the access token. At least not until I run the application again, because I just store it as a local variable. This is what the code looks like. So I'm going to declare these are the three objects I talked about earlier: the OAuth Client, the token request, and the token response. I'm going to open up a window that's going to prompt for the client ID and secret. Just so you can use it when you go to do this. I'm going to then get the message back that contains those values. I'm going to then add on the grant type. Now this is the only type that PowerBuilder currently supports, client credentials, and we'll get into later where there are other grant types that it might be useful in the future that PowerBuilder supports. But client credentials just means basically you're passing essentially a user ID and password, which is what we're doing here. It depends on the service what you're going to pass here, but we're gonna, for Twitter we pass a post. You didn't need to set these. I just set these just so you'd see how you would do it, because I'm setting these to the default value, which 0 means start at TLS 1.2 and work down until the service says OK. I can accept that protocol. So you always end up with the highest level of security possible. And then the timeout is the default of 60. This is the URL that Twitter says you need to use to do your token request. And what I found is that I needed to set do a set header for user agent to some value, and I just set it to PowerBuilder OAuth demo. If I didn't do that, Twitter wouldn't respond to my request, and I imagine they might be doing that to prevent somebody from spamming their servers with invalid requests. That's my guess anyway. So that's what I do in my code here is I do the set header and indicate some user agent here. Oh, too far, too fast. Hang on. Going back. Okay, so I create the OAuth client. I take my request, which is what I populated here. Response I'm going to get back from the service. So all I did so far is just declare an instance of it. I didn't populate anything. You notice I didn't actually. I created an OAuth client. The token request and token response I didn't have to create. I think maybe I create. Well, I didn't have to do the request because I got it from the window. But the response I don't have to create. I just pass the reference to it. And I destroy the client immediately just because I'm trying to keep things clean. What I'm going to do here, and this is just for demonstration purposes, I'm actually going to take my token response, and I have a window that actually displays everything that came back in the token response. You don't need to do that. That was just done in this demo just to kind of show you what came back from the service. The main thing I'm interested in from the response is the access token. So I say I just say get the access token. At that point, that search button wasn't enabled until I actually got a token back. So I set to enabled. There's some notes about what was going on here. I basically explained all this already. So this is what it looks like when that first window pops up. That's for the client credentials. Now, client credentials can take any of 4 different values for username, password, consumer key, or consumer secret. And so for Twitter, we happen to be using consumer key and consumer secret. So that's what I've actually populated here for my sample application. You'll need to populate those with whatever you have for the application you create when you want to test this out. And this is basically all that this window does is it takes the token request, grabs the values that the user may have entered, and returns the token request back to the original method. So this is the window that opens up to shows you what the response looks like. This is the primary thing we're interested in. This is the access token. It actually shows you the entire body, which includes the access token. The expiration flag, the 0 means that it doesn't expire, as I mentioned earlier. There's your status code we got back. Status text just means OK. And it indicates the token type we got back. And this is a bearer token. And if this had been some other code, you would have gotten some token error information, or hopefully you would have gotten some token error information down below here. This is the sample code for this window. I got ahead of myself. So we do a request for the access token, and basically I'm just setting, I'm get the access token, set it to the SLA. I do a response get body, send the the body and the MLA to the body. Here I'm just getting other parameters here, and just setting the values in the window. Notice for the token error, you pass in variables by reference, and then I set them to the SLA. Sorry about that. Okay. Now I'm going to request a resource. So, and this is once again where you're going to read some documentation. You're going to find out, well, to do a Twitter request, I'm going to use the get method. Once again, I just put these in here just so you can see how they're set, but these are set to the default, secure protocol and timeout. This is the URL that Twitter tells me I need to use. So this is basically the prefix of it. Then I add the question mark Q equals, and then my search term. In this case, pound PowerBuilder, but whatever the user put into the SLE. And then once again, like on the request for the token, I found that I needed to do set a header for the user agent, or else Twitter won't respond to me. So I'm doing that. I take the access token that I got before, and notice that this is just a part of that token request. This is the not the token request, but the OAuth request. One of the properties of the OAuth request is the access token that we got from the token request call. I create the OAuth client again. I do a request resource. Once again, I'm taking this request, which I've populated here, and sending that in, but my response is just declared. I didn't create anything, didn't set anything. That's going to get passed back to me by reference. And then I'm going to take that response, and I've created a window that just shows what the response is going to look like. The raw response, just for, once again, demonstration purposes. But then I'm also going to get the body from that response, which has the results of my search, and I'm going to stick them into the original window. Now, one thing you'll note here is I do have what I'm doing here is I'm do a get body. I do a get body on a blob. The blob contains UTF-8 encoded an UTF-8 encoded string. That's a difference. A little bit of difference in that PowerBuilder strings are normally UTF-16LE. If you take a string, what I'm saying is, if you take a string and just say blob on it, you'll get UTF-16LE. So when you convert a blob back to a string, if you don't indicate what the encoding is, PowerBuilder is going to assume that the encoding is UTF-16LE, and it will convert it into a string improperly, and you'll get garbage back. So you need to make sure that you, when you're converting the blob back from your JSON response, I'm sorry, your OAuth response, I mean here, your OAuth request response here. When you are converting it back to a string, you need to indicate that it's actually UTF-8 to get back a meaningful response. So once again, the timeout and secret approval are optional. We did the rest of this according to the Twitter docs. This is the window that shows everything you get back from the resource requests. So there's the body, which we're actually just going to stick into that main window anyway. And then once again, we got a status code and a status text. So if this was anything other than 200, hopefully we get some error information there in the status text. And now, once again, I mentioned, the OAuth client is one way to use OAuth. It's not the only way. The REST client has been modified in R3, so there is an additional method on the retrieve argument, on the retrieve method, to where you can pass in a token request argument, and it will use that to do the OAuth request for you and get a token response back and use that token for the retrieve method. It does that all for you under the covers. Now that may seem a little weird because you're thinking, if I send the token request in as an argument to the retrieve method, isn't it going to send it every time I do a retrieve? And the answer is actually no. PowerBuilder is smart enough to realize when it sees that token request argument, it's going to look at it and say, have I seen this token request argument before? And if I have, do I already have a response? If you already have a token using that token request argument, the next time you do a retrieve, PowerBuilder is just going to use the token it already has. It's not going to reissue the token request. So you don't have to worry about that. HTTP client doesn't have a specific method for doing a token request and dealing with the access token, but it's fairly easy to go ahead and do it. What you can do is you can use the OAuth client to go ahead and get your token, and then once you have your token, all you have to do is take your HTTP client and do a set header, put in the bare single space there, and add the access token, and it will pass the access token using the OAuth standard. So the last thing we're going to cover here is some of the JSON formats. So most of the JSON that if you're used to using JSON at all is just a very simple JSON format where it's name value pairs. That's what's called simple JSON here. And then we'll talk about something called standard DataWindow JSON in a moment. So here, the simple JSON, here you got the name value pairs, and you can have structures, and you can have arrays. It's basically just data. Okay. This is what standard DataWindow JSON looks at. So it's a little more complex, or actually it's a lot more complex. So there's actually a reference to, because you're generating this from a data window, there's actually a reference to the name of the data window. There's meta information about, sorry, a little too fast there. There's meta information about the columns. And then notice we've got the primary rows, filter rows, and delete rows. Those are the 3 data window buffers. It's representing the 3 data window buffers. So, and then there's each of the individual rows, and as we'll see as we go down into what each of those mean, you'll see there's actually state information about each of the rows and each of the columns. And there's also a buffer here for data window children. So if there's any data window children on the data window, they'll be passed along in the data window child's section of the JSON. Did I go too far? No, I didn't. Okay, so this is indication of the column metadata. So you see that there is the name of a column, the data type, whether or not it's nullable. A lot more information about the data rather than just data. Here's the data window standard row. You notice we have a row status indicator. We have the individual columns, and notice we have a current value. This is another item status setting, and the original value. So this is that idea that we're going to be getting full state. When we do the get full state, is we get back not just the data from this call, but we get back data about the data. We get state information back, and that allows us to take the data window in whatever state it's in, capture that, send it through JSON to the server, and then what the server gets when it brings this JSON into a data window on its side is it gets a mirror copy of what the data window looks like on the client, including all the individual state flag information on the individual rows and columns. So here's what a particular row looks like, where it actually has the data values. So that's what some of the different formats look like. Stay tuned for developments in PowerBuilder 2018, where they start giving you the ability to do some of that get full state, set full state capability. Along with that, there's some JSON exporting and importing functions that have been added as well. Now, there's a couple different there's actually like 4 different methods, 4 different variations of the export JSON method that you can use on a data window. The first one, the only argument it takes is a flag indicating whether you want simple JSON or the data window standard JSON. That will basically send you all the data from the data window. In the case of if you're using the DataWindows standard data window JSON, it will actually give you the delete and filter buffers as well. In the next version here, this is where you can actually specify what buffer you want to see. So you can say, just give me the data from the primary buffer, or just give me the data from the the filter buffer, or just the delete buffer, whatever. A specific buffer that you want data from. You can pass a flag indicating whether you want all of the rows or only rows that actually have been changed, that have different state information. And then once again, you've got your Boolean for your format. The third variation here is where you have individual flags. So this is in case where you may want more than one buffer. This second version only gives you the option to do one buffer. This one you can actually get the primary, the buffer, filter buffer, delete buffer, or the data window child buffers. So you get any combination of those 4 together or independently. And then once again, for all these, there is the Boolean, which has the format that you're getting the data in. This last one, it does indicate one buffer, but what we'd allowed to do here is if we want only a certain subset of the rows or columns in the data window that we actually want to generate into JSON, you would use that 4th option. Import's a little bit easier. There's only one import method. So notice the one thing you don't have here is you don't have a flag indicating the format, because the PowerBuilder is pretty smart. It's going to look at the JSON it got, and it's going to know whether or not it's simple JSON or the data window standard JSON. It doesn't need to be told that. So you pass in the JSON. Now, if you ever worked with the data pipeline object, you know you could pass in a string by reference, and it would give you back error information into that string. That's what this second argument is. is you pass in a string by reference, and if there's a problem importing the JSON, you'll get the error information back in that string. The rest, all these arguments other than the JSON itself are all optional. You can indicate that you want to import the JSON into a particular buffer, and you can also indicate that you want to start with a certain row or end with a certain row of data in the JSON, and that you want to start with a particular column or end with a particular column in the JSON, and actually start with a particular column in the data window. Start your import into a particular column. So that's the import. We're also going to look at merge and extract. What these are for is they deal with the fact that it's kind of like even with client-server PowerBuilder, what was usually the thing that took the most amount of time in any particular method was the actual communication of the data to and from the database. And we have that same issue, even compounded further, when we are dealing with sending data back and forth to a REST client. The most expensive operation that you're going to encounter is the transfer of data back and forth to the REST service. And so what you want to do whenever you're doing a REST service, if you want to speed things up, is you want to bundle your calls up. So if you've got a window and that window is going to show data from 4 different data sets, what you might want to do, rather than making 4 calls to your REST service to get the 4 different data sets, is to make 1 call and get all 4 data sets in 1 call. And that's what this JSON merge and extract does, is it allows you to bundle up the call into 1 call, so that the server uses a merge to put the data from the 4 data sets together into 1 JSON package, and then the client would use the extract to extract the 4 data sets back out in order to put them into the various windows. So we have a JSON package object, and this is what I just covered there. What we're looking at doing is reducing the number of database, not database, but the number of REST calls we're making. So there is a set method. There's actually a couple versions of it. So, and you call it several times. So you create your JSON package object, and then you say set value. And you can either give it a key, which basically is the name of the data set. So you might have, one key might be departments, another key might be employees. It's just something that when the client gets it, it knows to use that key to parse the data back out. And then the next thing is going to be a value. So this would be the actual raw JSON that we're going to want to include in this data set. Now you can either get the JSON from the data window and then send it in here, or you can actually just give it the name of the data window, and it will the JSON packager will extract the data from the data window and go ahead and set it to the key. Now you do that several times. So you do it for your department information, you do it for your employee information, you do it for whatever other information you want to send in the single call, and then we go ahead and get the merged JSON. So this is going to get 1 block of JSON that represents all of the data that we're going to send. You send that down to the client, and in this case I'm just talking about a retrieve, but it could go the other way as well. Then when the client gets it, it does the set method. So it's going to create its own JSON parser object. I'm not sorry, the JSON packager object. And then it's going to do a load string on the JSON that it got. And then it's going to use the get values to then extract the data back out into individual data sets. So this is where you would say, give me the employee data out of this bigger set of data. Give me the department data out of this bigger set of data. And then once again, I've got some sample code that'll be available on the website that you can do this with. It uses the data from the I've got another session where I talk about PostgreSQL, and actually uses the data from the PostgreSQL database I use for the demo there. So there, what it has there is a list of books and a list of authors. And what I will do, what it does then when you go on to do the merge extract, is it takes the data from this data window, which is the list of titles, and it takes the data from a data store, which has a list of authors, and it packages it all together, creates a single JSON object that has both sets of data, and then you can use the extract to parse it back out again. This is an example of what that looks like. This one's real simple. This goes back to this. So there's a format here, whether it's simple or DataWindow standard, and it just looks to see which one you picked and does the export JSON on it. I'm just using that first method that returns all the data out of the data window. And then once you've imported, once you've exported, I highlight or enable the import button. If you click the import button, what I do is I do a reset on the data window just to prove that there's no smoke and mirrors going on, that we are actually importing the data from JSON. I threw up a little message box just so you know, because this happens really quick. It is really fast in importing JSON. So I throw up that message box just so you get a chance to see that the data window is clear, and then I import the JSON back out of the MLE. And like I said, it is quick. Otherwise, you wouldn't notice that anything happened when we did that. This is an example using the JSON packager. So I have my authors data window, which is on a data store, and I retrieve that. The DW1, this is the data window that shows on the surface of the window that has the books. So then I say set value, I say books, and I give it the data window. I say set value authors, and I give it the data store. It takes both those sets of data, puts them together into one big JSON object. This gets that JSON object, just slaps it into the MLE. At that point, once you've done the merging, I turn on the extract button, and this is how we do the extract. In this case, all I do is I create another JSON package object, load the string back out of the MLE, and then I just say, oh, I just want to see what the author's information looks like, and I stick that back into MLE. So that way you see that huge data set, which has both books and authors, converted back into just the authors from that data set. Okay, so in summary, I know we covered a lot here. But these are all features that are introduced in PowerBuilder 2017 R2 and R3. So we have really greatly expanded our ability to use REST and to use OAuth. I mentioned that the client credentials was currently the only grant type that was supported by the OAuth client. One thing I'd like to see support for in later versions of PowerBuilder would be a support for JWT, which is JSON Web Token, or SAML, which are a couple other grant types that are real popular, rather than just the client credentials. However, I have another session where I'm talking about some of the encoding and encryption objects that were added in PowerBuilder 2017, and you could actually do the OAuth request yourself without even using the OAuth client object, using the capability that were added in PowerBuilder 2017 R3 for doing the encoding and encryption. So if you needed to use JWT, you could do that today using some of these encoding and encryption options and the HTTP client. So that's it. Actually going to mention one other thing before we go. I mentioned earlier that there were forums that people like myself hang out in and answer questions about PowerBuilder. One of the places we do that, primary place we do that, is at community.appeon.com. If that's something you're not familiar with, I would really highly recommend checking it out. It's not just forums, although that's where I spend most of my time there. There are tutorial articles, there are videos, there's all kinds of stuff on the site. It's really worth checking out. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And with that, I'd say thanks for your attention.